All right, we're in Acts. Acts chapter 26, we're finishing up. We noticed Paul's defense before Festus and Agrippa. And, basically says, look, I'm not an enemy of the law of Moses or of the temple. In fact, you can ask anybody and they'll tell you how zealous I was for the religion of my fathers, Pharisee and so forth. And in fact, he says in his defense, I was a great persecutor of Christians. And then he recounts his encounter with Christ. It's interesting, my Bible, has these little headings in it, and it says, Paul recounts his conversion in my Bible. Well, does anybody see Paul's conversion in this account? No. Now, we do see that in chapters 9 and 22. Now, this is the third time that he has recounted this experience on the road, so obviously it's important. But there's more detail here given as far as what the Lord said to him. And of course, he appeared to him so as to make him an apostle. And he also tells him about what he's going to, what his mission and ministry is going to be about, what his purpose from this point on in his life is going to be about, and so forth. And so Paul says, I did that. And he says, look, the only reason I'm here, and the only reason I've received these accusations is because of my belief and my firm trust and confidence in one thing. And what is that? The resurrection from the dead, and specifically, of course, Christ's resurrection from the dead. And so at this point, and I think we discussed this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, but at this point he's interrupted by Festus. In verse 24, Paul, you are beside yourself, the New King James says, and these words that are used for that, in that phrase, for that whole phrase, really, the Greek word there, and also that word for mad, much learning is driving you mad. The word from which we get our word mania or maniac. But basically he says, Paul, you're out of your mind. Your education is driving you insane. And he admits that Paul's a highly educated man. But it's driving you insane. But Paul said, I'm not insane. Notice he's calm and collected. Most noble Festus, even, he's just as courteous as he always is. But I speak the words of truth and reason. Or truth, I think some translations say truth and soberness. That is, I speak words of a sound mind. I'm not crazy. And of course, when you talk about truth, you are talking about something that is rational. Christianity is that which is defendable and provable and rational, comports with reason and logic, and it's not some secluded esoteric system. As he talks about here, it's not escaped their notice, but it's grounded in history. Notice he says, for the king before whom I also speak freely, talking about Agrippa, knows these things. So he basically says in a polite way, Festus, you may not know about these things. I mean, I realize you may be a little ignorant about these things, but King Agrippa's not. He knows about all this. For I am convinced that none of these things escapes his attention. Again, Christianity is based in historical fact. Since this thing was not done in a corner. And Agrippa being charged of the Jewish temple and so forth, and as he says, an expert in Jewish law and customs, he knows. He knows what happened. He knows about these things. And so he says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? And I think this is kind of where we got to last week. Well, what's Agrippa going to say? I mean, here's a fellow that has to work with the Jewish people on a regular basis. So how's he going to respond to that? No, I don't believe in the old law. Commentators believe maybe there's even a gesture here on the part of the king. Maybe he nods his head in some way, while Paul's speaking. And because Paul says, I know that you believe the prophets, the writings, the old law. And so it's interesting. Paul's making a defense before these men, and yet he kind of becomes the questioner and the interrogator. And so Paul draws this conclusion. Yeah, I know you believe. And this response on the part of Agrippa is the subject of a lot of controversy, as you probably well know. Because the New King James reads, Then Agrippa said to Paul, You almost persuade me to become a Christian. I think the King James Version says what? Almost thou persuadest. Well, that makes for a very nice song, but that's not in the Greek. That's not what the Greek language says. Literally, it says, In a little you are persuading me to make a Christian. The New American Standard renders it this way, which is a very good rendering. In a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. And so that's the true rendering. But still, whether it's Greek or English, Arndt says that this word means in a few words or in a short time. Perhaps it could be translated easily or without much effort. But it's not almost persuaded. So, regardless of that, regardless of the correct phraseology, that doesn't answer the question. Grammar doesn't answer the question as to what? What's the controversy here? What's the issue? About his response. Was he being sincere or was he being sarcastic? That's what we don't know. And the grammar itself is not going to tell you that. I mean, if he just says in but a little time or in a few words you would make me a Christian, without being there to hear how he said that, context, that's why we sometimes talk about the inadequacy of text messaging and emails, right? You send a text message or an email and somebody takes it in some unintended way. Why? Because they didn't get the inflection in your voice or the tone in which you said it. And so that's important. So, which is it? Most modern commentators, I believe, take the position that he was not being sincere, that he was not convicted, but that he was being sarcastic. However, just to take the other side, let's continue reading and see if there's any indicators that could go the other way. And why they say that, I don't know, really. I mean, they all have their own explanations or beliefs. And again, these are just commentators, so it's not, they don't know any more than we do. But most modern commentators believe take that position. But notice what Paul says. First of all, Agrippa says, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. Keep that in mind. Now look at Paul's response. And Paul said, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me today might become both almost and altogether such as I am, except for these chains. You can just see Paul just kind of holds his hands up, except for these chains. Now, first of all, it's interesting to me that the king uses what word in his response? That not every Roman, Festus probably wouldn't have used this term, may not even know much about it by this point, huh? Christian. Agrippa knows something about Christianity, and in fact, it tells us that this word has been in vogue now by this time, even though it was given in Antioch of Syria by God through Paul and Barnabas. back in chapter 11, 26. So it's been in use for some time and is apparently in vogue, and Agrippa is aware of it. He uses the term Christian. But maybe the best way to get a feeling for Agrippa's tone is to determine, how did Paul take his tone? How does it appear to you? Now, somebody could say, well, Paul's just being polite, and I suppose that's true. He could take a sarcastic response and not be sarcastic himself and just come back with a sincere response. But it almost appears that Paul at least believes somewhat that what? What about Agrippa's response? Huh? Maybe he is being sincere. I would to God that not only you, but everybody in this room would obey the gospel. So I don't know. It's an interesting controversy and not one that we have to solve, obviously. But Paul has made his point and his mark on this whole thing and this whole proceeding. So, how is his case disposed of? When he had said these things, the king stood up, as well as the governor and Bernice and those who sat with them. And when they had gone aside, they talked among themselves, saying, and they're not arguing, nobody's disagreeing, they just say, hey, present tense, they keep on saying among themselves, this man is doing nothing deserving of death or chains. Well, no criticism here. Now, it didn't appear that any of them obeyed the gospel, but at least they appeared to be fair-minded people. And Agrippa doesn't seem to have the same kind of disposition as his relatives and ancestors, those bloody Herods before him. So they keep saying he's not worthy of death or bonds. And so we have to ask the question, after we read verse 32, then Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he'd not appealed to Caesar. Why don't they just set him free? I mean, haven't they just basically said he's not guilty? So why not set him free? Well, commentators point out a couple of things. Basically, it's a matter of protocol here in the Roman legal system. Because once Paul had appealed to Caesar, to have acquitted him would have offended some people. Number one, it would have offended who? Caesar, right? The prisoners appealed to Caesar. Well, you don't have to go to him. They weren't going to offend the emperor. But number two, and perhaps just as important to Festus, is you then offend who else? If you just let him go after he's appealed this proceeding. Huh? Yeah, his accusers, the people that he has to govern, the people in his province. Because then you're breaking with protocol and legal procedure just to let him go. Well, we're the ones that accused him. He wants another hearing in front of Caesar, and you let him go. So they're not going to run the risk of that. So on to Caesar he'll go. And yeah. 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 All of them served at the pleasure of the emperor. Yeah. Which is what we do today, yeah. And even today, when maybe, someone's job doesn't depend directly on it, but think about these guys. They serve at the pleasure of the emperor, so they have to keep him happy. And the number one way to keep him happy is to keep peace wherever they're in charge and to collect the taxes, right? So, yeah, it's politics. And in fact, as many commentators have said, you will not find another historical document like the book of Acts, like what Luke wrote, that documents Roman politics, Roman procedure, life in the first century. And what we're going to see in the next two chapters is seagoing life on the Mediterranean in the first century. There's no other document of antiquity that documents the kind of things that Luke does. And so that's why he's considered to be a first-rate, top-of-the-line historian, and of course he had some help with that, obviously. Well, everybody goes their separate ways, basically all of these people involved, into historical oblivion except Paul. Festus died not long after having served only almost 2 years in office. Agrippa lived another 40 years and died around AD 100, and that marked the end of the Herodian dynasty. Bernice continued to live her scandalous life, as we mentioned, became mistress to Titus, who was 10 years her junior. Of course, Titus was the general who concluded the siege and destruction of Jerusalem after his father Vespasian became emperor. Again, Luke has given lots of space to Paul's defenses, but this was really a test case which provided a charter of liberty really to Christian evangelism, especially in the first century. And again, as Dave has mentioned, there's really no other document which authenticates the political actions of the Roman Empire as you find in the book of Acts. Well, let's talk about his seagoing adventure here. Paul was a man of adventure, you'd have to say that. Let's begin chapter 27 on his trip, his harrowing trip to Rome, I guess you would say. Some people ask the question, and I guess it's easy to think about this, why, when you get through reading chapter 27, which starts when they leave Caesarea, and then they had, when they are shipwrecked on the island of Malta, why is this in here, really? What is this? What are some of the things that it teaches us, tells us? Partly the reason it's in here is because it's obviously, you would have a gap in the history. What's this leading up to, obviously? Where's Paul headed? He's headed for his hearing before Caesar. And so if you leave out the voyage and you just say, well, then he got to Rome, that kind of leaves out some of the build-up. So obviously it's part of the historical narrative. But the amazing thing when we read this chapter, and you're going to see, is that even when Paul, he's not a sailor by training, right? What's Paul other than a preacher? He's a tent maker, so he's a landlubber, as Popeye would say. And he's also a prisoner, by the way, along with a bunch of other prisoners. He's just part of a group. You can see them filing onto the ship, all of them in chains. And yet, as we read this chapter, when danger arises, who does everybody look to? Who becomes the most dominating personality on this voyage? And he's not in charge. And yet, Paul becomes the guy everybody looks to. It's amazing.
Okay.
Yeah, that's possible. Certainly the centurion, the people on the ship probably weren't, but it's possible the centurion was, Julius could have been present at Paul's defense and trial there before Festus, so maybe he was impressed from the very beginning. As someone might say, you often wonder, was, Cornelius there? Who was there who heard Paul's defense? And yes, that's possible. You also have to wonder too, and it's interesting the way the Bible works. It's not God didn't give us His Word just to satisfy all our curiosities. But you also wonder at the end of this chapter, after what happened, how did it affect the other soldiers, the other prisoners? Did any of them obey the gospel, after these events? We don't know. We're not told. And we're not meant to know. But again, as I've already mentioned, some naval experts have remarked that even though Luke was not a professional seaman, he certainly was a close and accurate observer of winds, storms, management and movements of ships. And again, we get more information of ancient navigation in these 2 chapters than any single document of antiquity. Let's pick up there in verse 1. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship of a Dramatium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. When we put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. Well, so they sailed northward up the Mediterranean coast for about 60 miles, stopping at Sidon. And we know Sidon to be a city of what people or country? Phoenicia, right? Phoenicia, a famous seagoing people of commerce and trade. And so they stop at Sidon, and it's interesting that Julius allows Paul, to see his friends. Now go back to the beginning and notice it says it was decided that who should sail to Italy? We. Well, what does that tell us? All right, Luke's with him again. We don't know when Luke joined the company, but he's with him now. And it would appear that, maybe he accompanies him as his own personal physician. And also, if you go through this chapter, for instance, the word there in verse 2, just as an example of Luke's history here, that word to set sail, the King James says launched, but that Greek word is a very technical nautical term that was used then. And I'm not going to pronounce it, but it just simply means to put out to sea. And so, again, Luke's use of these technical nautical terms we see going on throughout this chapter. Only 2 centurions are named. We hear about centurions in the New Testament, but only 2 are named. Who are they? Easy question, right? Cornelius and Julius. And both, interestingly enough, leave us with a favorable impression, do they not? The centurions were obviously pretty stable personalities. Was that a centurion that stood at the cross and said what? Surely this man was what? Son of God. And so a favorable impression from both of these that are named. The Dramatium was a seaport of Mysia, part of Roman Asia. And of course, if it was bound for its home port, it would probably be touching various harbors along the Asian coast. And then, of course, the idea is to get a connection with a ship that's eventually going on to Rome. Aristarchus. Well, we've heard of Aristarchus, have we not, of Thessalonica, faithful helper of Paul. He was roughed up in Ephesus during that riot, chapter 19, verse 29. Later traveled with Paul in his 3rd missionary campaign, chapter 20, verse 4. Paul mentions Aristarchus in 2 of his letters, Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, and Philemon 24. It's interesting that he calls him, I believe in Philemon, a fellow prisoner. We don't know if that's actual or metaphorical. but certainly he went through some tough times with Paul. And according to tradition, he was martyred during the administration of Nero, like I'm sure many Christians were. So they get to Sidon, and Julius treats Paul kindly. I think the King James says courteously, but that word, interestingly, is philanthropos, compound of philos, love, and anthropos, human being. So kindly is a good translation there, and gives him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. And that word that's used for care is a medical term, so perhaps some medical assistance. And it already tells you, we're already seeing something a little bit about Julius's character and perhaps about the way he feels about Paul, that he has some respect for him and trust him to allow him to do this. They sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary, and then they come to Myra. So they had some issues with the wind, and so they sail on the more protected eastern side of Cyprus. Myra, if you look at a map, if you look in the maps in the back of your Bible, it's a little town in Lycia, and you're going to say, now why would anybody go that way to get to Rome if you were coming from Egypt, right? Well, if you're going from northern Africa to Italy, why wouldn't you just cut, what's the shortest distance between 2 points? Straight line, yeah. But why would they not do that across the Mediterranean Sea? Well, I mean, that's 2,000 years ago. How far would you want to get away from land if you were sailing without compass or any other modern navigational tools? That'd be kind of like saying, I'll just take a chance and maybe we'll run into something somewhere at the other end of this piece of water. So they generally stayed close to the coast. So they're moving on. All right. And then they find this Alexandrian ship. And that's why I mentioned the fact that that from Egypt, why would they come that way instead of straight across? And so, and that's the reason. This ship was pretty good size. How do I know that? How do I know this ship was pretty good size? Yeah, go down to verse 37. How many people were in it? 276. 276. Josephus tells of sailing on a ship from Palestine to Rome that carried 600 passengers. And some warships during that day carried as many as 1,000 soldiers. They have actually found paintings of such ships at Herculaneum and Pompeii that date within 20 years of Paul's time. And I meant to ask my daughter, she's in the other class. She'd been to Pompeii, and I meant to ask her if she saw any of these drawings of these ships when she was in Pompeii. But nevertheless, due to the headwinds, they sailed slowly along the southern coast of Asia. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. Well, difficult, winds are strong, so they're forced to turn south toward Crete. Crete's a mountainous island near the entrance of the Aegean Sea. To the north, it's about 155 miles long by 35 miles north and south. And so they're plowing along the eastern coast here, trying to get protection from the winds. And after rounding the end of the island, they struggle along until they hit Fair Havens, which is about midway along the coast of the island. And here's where they make a bad decision. Fair Havens is an open harbor. And look at verse 9. Now when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, now this is not prophetic. He's not inspired here. This is just his opinion based upon, Paul's been on these ships before, and he's sailed on the Mediterranean, remember, during his missionary journey, so he has a little experience with this. And he says, I perceive, this is my opinion, that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss. Hurt, damage, and loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. So we don't have much further to go. This is not a great place to harbor. It's not commodious to winter in. And so you got a no-win situation. Late in the season, the fast, that's associated with the Jewish Day of Atonement, occurred in early October, was past, and so the dangerous season was upon them. According to one ancient writer, Vegetius, the perilous time for navigation on the Mediterranean was from September 14th to November the 11th. What happened after November the 11th? Anybody? The dangerous time is from September 14th to November the 11th. What happened after November the 11th? Nobody sailed. Nobody. It's not like today where we just sail and fly anywhere we want to all the time. When it got to the middle of November until March, nobody sailed the Mediterranean. It's just like when you read, you can go back only 200 years ago. Any of you studied military history? How many night battles do you read about in the American Civil War? None. Nobody fights at night. How would they do that? They can't see. You end up shooting your own men like they shot Stonewall Jackson. They didn't know who he was. So once nightfall came, you just stopped. How many battles did they fight in the middle of the wintertime? Not many. Even on land, because why? Well, you got mud and rain. You got to pull all those cannons and all that stuff through that mess. You just stop. So that's what they did then. You just didn't travel in the winter. That's why they're looking for a place to, quote, winter in. We got to find a place to stay for the next 5 months till we can get back on a boat. But this is a dangerous time out on the open sea. Those words for helmsman in the New King James and owner of the ship, master in the King James, that means the steersman or the pilot. The helmsman is the pilot. Now that word for owner actually can either mean in the Greek owner or captain. But either way, both of the guys in charge of the boat didn't want to stay there. And then you have to ask your question again, why is Paul even there? He's a prisoner with a bunch of other prisoners. Why is he even in the group, having this discussion? Other than the fact that maybe they knew he had a little experience with, being on the open seas during a bad part of the year. But this Greek word for perceive, I perceive, means the result of past experience and observation. And yet they weren't persuaded by Paul's warnings. The majority view was, let's try to reach Phoenix, 40 miles to the west. That is generally identified with the harbor now called Phoenicia. And so a gentle south wind starts blowing, and they think, here's our shot. Verse 13. When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose. Now, the King James and New King James said Euroclydon. That's not generally the word in the oldest manuscripts. Euroquilo is generally the word found in the earliest Greek manuscripts, but it's what we might call a northeaster. It comes rushing down from the Cretan mountains, which rose about 7,000 feet above sea level. And by the way, the Greek word there for tempestuous headwind is the word we get for the English word typhoon, but a pretty bad wind. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff, that is the lifeboat, with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables. Apparently they had enough calm weather for a short time. They'd take some cables and ropes and wrap around the bottom of the ship to undergird it and strengthen it, fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands. The Syrtis sands were some, I think, quicksands, it says in the King James. But these were two large sandbars on the Libyan coast of Africa. And according to commentators, it was the graveyard for many a Mediterranean sailor. And so they were concerned about that, so they struck sail and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship, started throwing out some of the tackle, so forth, cargo. On the third day, that's when they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. They were in the grip of fear. And it's interesting, these sandbars were still about 400 miles away, but they were concerned about it. And it's a shallow gulf about 275 miles wide. And so this says, I'm trying to find the Greek term here about they set sail, but actually the word there has probably struck sail, has to do with letting down the anchors to ensure some stability as far as the Greek is concerned. Not actually striking a mainsail or something of that nature, but letting down anchors for stability. And so they don't see the sun or the stars for days on end, so therefore they can't check their astronomical astronomical observation. They can't check their location. They still had food, but apparently nobody really had an appetite. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, the reason I said that about striking the sails, because that Greek word for struck actually means let down or lowered. And so that's why most commentators believe there he's talking about anchors, not actual sails as far as the Greek language is concerned. So they're going without food, and that doesn't mean they're not snacking some, but probably not much of an appetite, so they're not eating much. And so Paul says, men, you should have listened to me and have not sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Well, some commentators have accused Paul of being a little, what's the word we would use? Yeah, a little smart alecky, a little snurpy here, you know. I told you so. If you'd listened to me, this wouldn't happen. No, I don't get Paul doing that. Why would he say that, though? You should have listened to me. Why would he say that? I told you once what to do, and you didn't listen to me. You should have listened to me, which is a prelude to what? Now what I'm getting ready to tell you, would you listen to me this time? You're not trying to be smart alecky about it. He's just setting the stage for, hey, maybe it is time to listen to me. It's not a petty I told you so.
It's not the first time to be on the boat.
You need to be of good cheer and lift your spirits, because this time it's not an opinion. This time, I have received word directly from God Himself, from His angel. And so, this is prophetic. And by the way, this is the God whom I belong, whose I am. He owns me. And I constantly serve Him. And notice He says He's the God. There's only one true God. Most of these men would have been pagans. And it's interesting, and we'll leave you with this thought. The angel doesn't appear to Paul and say, tell these fellows not to be afraid. The angel appears to Paul and says what? Before that, what's the first thing he says? Fear not, in present tense imperative mood, which means you're telling somebody to stop doing something he is already doing. So what does that tell me about Paul? Paul was afraid. Paul was afraid. He was afraid just like everybody else on this boat. And again, that goes back to the point we've made before. It's easy to place Paul and men like him on a pedestal and say, you know, they're somehow superhuman. But Paul feels the same emotions and concerns and fears as everybody else, and Paul is afraid just like everybody else on this boat. So the first thing the angel says to Paul is, you stop being afraid.